time is 7 to 9 minutes. This is not the most positive speech that I'm ever going to give, and that's an understatement. However, in our journeys in life, sometimes we got to recognize where we are, and sometimes it's a little bit odious, the recognition of where we are in our own lives or where we are in society. I want to start out by asking the question, and now this is from, for those of you who are from different continents, I'm talking about from this continental perspective. What comes to mind first when you think of slavery? Anybody? Slavery.
The American slave trade?
American slave trade. We think of a black person being owned and ruled over by a white person. However, what if I was to tell you that slavery has been an institution which has existed in every society since the dawn of time? It has been found that even in the Code of Hammurabi, which is a long ways ago, it was defined in law what a slave was. And many of these societies had 40 to 80% of the populace were slaves. It was not until 1833 when, after a long protracted effort by what was called the abolitionist movement, that slavery, once and for all, in most of the Western world was abolished. And it wasn't just abolished. The British Royal Navy became involved in trying to abolish it, and the slave running boats in other parts of the world. Now, this was a problem because I want to make the case that slavery still exists today. And I want to make the case that I'm not just talking about open-air slave trade, which happens today in auctions in Libya. I'm not talking necessarily about that, although that is incredibly heinous. What I'm talking about is that we here today are slaves. That's a hard thing to take, maybe. However, what I'm going to do is make the case that empires exist of war and for war, fundamentally. Both civil war within and imperialistic wars outside. And as I see it, there are approximately 4 major empires at play in the world right now. There is the Western Empire, which I would call the Anglo-American Empire, which has its headquarters in Washington, London, and potentially Rome. There's also the Russian Empire, which is headquartered in Moscow. There's the Chinese Empire, which is headquartered in Beijing. And there is arguably, although it's a little bit dicey to say, there's the Muslim Empire, which is so fractured based on wars that have been going on and power plays taking place in there, where the real power center that remains that has not been taken over yet is Iran, the headquarter in Tehran. Now, all of these empires operate on a similar way. It is a form of doing business on a large scale. And in the world, there are those who want to control others, and there's those who want to be free. Basically, it falls down into those categories of people. And the problem for what I'm going to call the oligarchs, the ones who want to control us, is that the moment freedom begins to blossom again in the world, there has to be a lid to put on that blossom. Otherwise, once that genie's out of the bag, it can be very difficult to put it back in. Well, it got out of the bag probably several times in history, but one of them was through what was called the Enlightenment era of perhaps the 1700s. And following that, we had the flourishing of the Industrial Revolution, once again, the abolitionist movement, and people were becoming free. But that was a real problem. The methodology of putting that genie back in the bottle is war. And it's done principally in 2 ways. The empire has got to have endless supply of money, and it's got to have slaves. It's got to have both. And when the Western world, which was headquartered, the Anglo-American world, fomented the First World War. And just before the First World War, if you look at it, there was the formation of the Federal Reserve, and there was the formation of income tax. The formation of the Federal Reserve Bank, which is not federal, it has no reserves, and it's not a bank, is a private organization run by oligarchs that gets to print money when nobody else can. And they were able to fund the war ad nauseum. Most people figured the war would be over in 6 months because they'd run out of money, but they just kept it going because they could print the money. And that's how the First World War was able to be. And the other problem is that they have to be able to compel people to fight. You cannot compel free people to fight. Free people do not want to fight. The president at the time, who was in charge of the US, which was the center of this empire at the time, was named Woodrow Wilson, and he oversaw the implementation of the Federal Reserve and the Income Tax Act. And his chief advisor was a guy named Edward Mandelhouse. And this is what he wrote at the time when this was being implemented. Because once again, free people, a huge problem. We can't make them fight. What he said to Woodrow Wilson, I'll read it. Very soon, every American will be required to register their biological property in a national system designed to keep track of the people, and it will operate under an ancient system of pledging. By such a methodology, we can compel the people to submit to our agenda, which will affect their security as a chargeback for our fiat currency. Every American will be forced to register or suffer to be unable to work for a living. They will be our chattel, and we will hold the security interest over them forever by operation of law merchant under a scheme of secured transaction. Every American, by unknowingly and unwittingly delivering the bill of lading to us, will have rendered themselves bankrupt and insolvent, forever to remain economic slaves through taxation, secured by their pledges designed to make us profits, and they will not be the wiser. For not 1 in a million man would ever figure out our plan, and if 1 or 2 of them figured it out, we would have at our arsenal plausible deniability. After all, this is the only logical way to fund government, aka empire, by floating liens and debts to the registrants in the form of benefits and privileges. This will inevitably reap us huge profits beyond our wildest dreams, and every American will be the contributor to this fraud that we call social insurance. Without realizing it, every American will insure us for any losses we incur in this manner. Every American will unknowingly be our servant, forever begrudgingly. The people will become helpless and without any hope of redemption, and we will employ the highest office of the president of our dummy corporation to foment this plot against America. And folks, that was written just before the First World War. Woodrow Wilson took his advice and they went forward with it. And what became of that is a system of citizenship, which was a federal citizenship, basically defined as a slave. The problem is that the ugly head for the oligarchs of freedom has started to sprout again. And the scapegoating has come back, and the media is full of it. The scapegoating is things like the white nationalists. It's the Russians, you know. It's the Islamic terrorists, you know. And we have to do something. And the armadas are sailing. Let's not make the mistake again, because the winds of war are brewing. Let's not let it happen. In the words of Martin Luther King, let freedom ring. Let's unshackle our slavery, and let's let freedom ring, because free people do not want war. Madam Postmaster.